In the late spring of the year, in a small walled town in the south of an old kingdom, in the cool stone shadow of a great cathedral that had been 3 centuries in the building and was still not finished, a young woman of 19 years stood at the window of her father's house and looked down into the square below. It was a Tuesday morning. It was the first really warm morning of the spring. Her name was Isabel. She was wearing a soft, pale blue gown that her older sister Margaret had given her for her last birthday. She was meant to be mending a tear in one of her father's shirts, but the light at the window had been better than the light at the small table where she usually sat, and she had brought the shirt over, and then she had set it down on the windowsill, because the square below had filled with the small soft sounds of a market morning, and she had wanted, for a moment, to look. She saw a man on a bay horse. His name was Thomas. He was 23 years old. He was a knight of the household of the lord of the next valley to the east, and he had ridden into the town that morning with 3 other men of his lord's household on an errand involving the purchase of a particular kind of cloth that was woven in this town and in no other. He was wearing a plain dark blue coat-hardy and a short cloak of the same color. His hair, which was a dark chestnut brown, was a little long and a little untidy. He was laughing at something one of his companions had said. He was not, by any reasonable standard, the most handsome man in the square. He had a long, thin face. His nose had been broken once and badly set. There was a small white scar through his upper lip from a fall he had taken from a horse when he was 9. Isabel watched him until he and his companions rode out of the square through the western gate. She stood at the window for some time after he was gone, looking at the place he had been. She did not know, that morning, what to do with what had just happened to her. She picked up the shirt from the windowsill. She sat down at the small table. She tried to mend the tear. She found, after several minutes, that her hands were shaking very slightly, and that she could not remember the simple stitch he had been using on shirts since she was 11 years old. She set the shirt down again. She did not tell anyone that day what had happened. She thought about him for the rest of the spring and the summer. She did not see him again. The town was small, but the lord's holding lay in the next valley, and the men of his household did not come often. Twice in the next 2 months she heard a horse in the square that sounded like the right horse, and she went to the window, and it was someone else. Once she saw, in the cathedral on a Sunday in midsummer, a man with the same dark chestnut hair, and her heart turned over, and the man turned his head and was a stranger. Her sister Margaret, who was 23 and had been married for 2 years to a man from the same town, came to visit one afternoon in late July. They sat in the small garden behind their father's house. Margaret looked at Isabel for a long while. "What is wrong with you?" Margaret said. "Nothing is wrong with me. You have not, in 3 months, picked up the new embroidery you were so excited about. You have not asked when I am coming over. You have not finished any of the books you were reading. You sit at the front window in the mornings as if you are waiting for someone. Who are you waiting for, little Isabel?" Isabel looked at her sister. Her sister looked back. "I do not know his name," Isabel said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a small, kind laugh, not a mocking one, and she took Isabel's hand. "Tell me about him," she said. So Isabel told her. There was very little to tell. A man on a bay horse on a Tuesday morning in May who had ridden out through the western gate and not come back. The knowledge settled in her chest like a small heavy stone that this was the man she had been waiting for, although she had not known she had been waiting for anyone. Margaret listened. When Isabel had finished, Margaret was quiet for a long while. "You have to find out his name," Margaret said. "How?" "There is a fair in 2 weeks, the feast of St. Anselm. The household of the Lord in the next valley will send men. They always do. He may come, or someone who knows him may come. You will go to the fair, you will look. If he is there, you will know. If someone who knows him is there, you will ask. I cannot ask a strange man about another man, Margaret. You can, or I can. We will find out his name." So Isabel went to the fair on the feast of St. Anselm, with her sister beside her, in the warm August afternoon, in her best gown. She did not see him at first. She walked through the stalls in the square. She drank a small cup of warm, spiced wine. The traveling musician played a slow tune on his fiddle. The bell of the cathedral rang the hour, and then, across the square, she saw him. He was standing with 3 other men of his lord's household by a stall of leather goods. He was wearing the same dark blue coat-hardy. He was laughing at something. Isabel was not, in that moment, capable of seeing what. She turned to her sister. Margaret was already looking at her with the patient face of an older sister who had understood the situation in a single glance. "That is him," Margaret said. "Yes. Go and walk in the cathedral close. It will be cooler there. I will find his name. I will come and find you." "How will you find his name?" "Isabel. I have lived in this town for 23 years. I know a quarter of the men in his lord's household by name from their fathers." "Go." Isabel went. She walked into the cool green shade of the cathedral close. She sat down on one of the old stone benches under the lime trees. She put her hands in her lap. She listened to the small soft sounds of the fair coming over the wall. She was sitting there perhaps a quarter of an hour when a shadow fell across the path in front of her. She looked up. It was Thomas. He was standing perhaps 4 paces away with his cap in his hands. Margaret was not with him. "Forgive me," he said. "I do not know your name. I came across the square because I saw you. I did not want to come back to my lord's house this evening without knowing your name." Isabel said her name. He said his. There was a silence of perhaps 3 breaths. He stood with his cap in his hands. She sat with her hands in her lap. Neither of them said anything else. And in those 3 breaths, Isabel understood, with a clarity that she had not had at the window in May, that her sister had told this man where to find her, that her sister had used the small careful authority of an older sister to tell a strange man at a leather stall that there was a young woman in the cathedral close who had been looking at him, and that this man, whose name she now knew, had walked across the square to find her. "I will walk with you," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked through the close and out under the south transept arch and along the river path that ran behind the cathedral for perhaps an hour. They did not speak of very much. He told her where he came from. She told her where her father's country property was. He had a sister, he said, who was also called Isabel, which had made him smile when a sister had told him the name. She laughed quietly at that. He told her about his bay mare. She told him about her father's old grey gelding. He picked her a small pale blue flower from the bank of the river path and gave it to her, and she pressed it that night between the pages of her psalter, and it stayed there for 43 years. They walked back to the square as the afternoon was beginning to go gold. At the edge of the square he stopped, and he looked at her, and he said, "I would like to come and call on your father." She said, "Yes, please." He came to her father's house the following Sunday afternoon, after Mass, in his best coat hardy, and with his hair washed and combed, and he asked Isabel's father, very formally, whether he might be permitted to pay a courteous visit to his daughter Isabel, with a view to making her better acquaintance. Isabel's father was a wool merchant named John, a careful, steady man of 51, who had been a widower for 12 years and who had raised his 2 daughters with the help of his sister and his own quiet care. He looked at Thomas for a long moment in silence. "You have a lord," he said. "I do, and he is not a wealthy lord. He is not. And you are a younger son of a younger son." "I am." "Then you understand," John said, "that I am looking for a husband for my daughter who can offer her the kind of life I have made for her here. I do not say this to insult you. You seem a respectable young man. But I cannot, in good conscience, encourage a courtship that I will in the end have to refuse, and I do not wish to make my daughter unhappy." Thomas was silent for a moment. He looked at his hands, then he looked up at John. "I understand," he said. "May I ask one thing?" "You may." "May I be permitted to write to her? Letters only. No visits, no promises, only letters. I will accept any conditions you set on the correspondence. I will not pursue anything further with you or with her unless, and until I am in a position to come to you with an offer that meets the standard you have just described. I do not know if I will ever be in such a position. I think it is unlikely, but I would like to be permitted to write to her." John looked at the young knight in his washed coat hardy for a long while. He thought perhaps of his own youth and of a young woman in a town further south whom he had not been allowed to write to and who had married a man in her own town and had, by the careful, slow workings of 40 years, become a small private thread of regret in his own heart. He closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. "You may write to her," he said. "I will read the first 3 letters. If they are what you say they will be, I will not read any after that. But if I ever find a letter that is not, correspondence will end, and you will not enter this house again. Do you agree?" "I agree." "Then go home, Thomas," John said, "and write to her. Thomas went home and he wrote to her. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was 3 pages long in a careful round hand. It told her about his ride home from the town and about a small incident with his bay mare on the road through the eastern hills, and about a book of pilgrim tales he had been reading in the evenings, and about the way the light fell across the courtyard of his lord's manor at dawn. He did not say anything about love. He did not need to. The whole letter was the letter of a young man who had found, in 3 pages about his horse and his book and the morning light, a way of speaking to a young woman that was entirely about her without ever naming her. Isabel read it 3 times. She wrote back the same evening. Her father read the first letter. He read the second. He read the third. He did not read any after that. The correspondence settled over the months of the autumn and the winter into a rhythm. A letter from him perhaps every 2 weeks. A letter from her in reply the week after. They wrote about books. They wrote about the weather. They wrote about people they had known, Thomas about his sister, the other Isabel, Isabel about her sister Margaret and her small new niece. They wrote about a stretch of road Thomas had ridden in a thunderstorm, and about a child of Isabel's neighbor who had been sick and had recovered, and about a particular kind of cake Isabel's father's cook made on the feast of St. Stephen. They did not, on the whole, write about the thing that lay underneath the letters. They did not need to. The thing that lay underneath was understood. In the 3rd year of the correspondence, when Isabel was 22, the letters almost ended. It was a small thing, in the way these things are usually small things. Isabel had received, in the late autumn of that year, an offer of marriage from a man she did not love. The man was a draper from the city to the north, a widower of 38 with 2 young children who had come south on business and had met Isabel at a small dinner her father had given for one of his clients. The draper had liked her. He had spoken to her father. The match was a good one. The draper had a substantial business and was a kind man. Isabel's father, who was getting old and who had begun, in the small careful way of fathers with unmarried daughters, to think about what would happen to her if he died, had asked her to consider the offer seriously. Isabel had written to Thomas about it. She had not asked him to do anything. She had only told him. She had felt, in the small, honest way of a woman in a long correspondence, that she could not keep something this large from him. Thomas's reply, when it came, had been very short, 2 paragraphs. He wrote that he understood. He wrote that he wished her well. He wrote that if she chose to accept the offer, he would not, of course, continue the correspondence after her marriage, because that would not be fair to her husband, and that he wanted her to know in advance that he would not write again after the wedding day. The letter was perfectly correct. It was also, Isabel understood when she read it, a letter written by a man who had been hurt in a way he was determined not to show. She did not write back for a week. She thought about the letter for that week. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the draper from the north, who had been kind and who had spoken to her father in the proper way and who had 2 children who would need a mother. She thought about the small house in the city to the north that the draper had described to her. She thought about her own father, getting older in his small house in the south, who had read 3 of Thomas's letters and then no more. In the 2nd week she wrote to Thomas. She wrote, *Thomas. I have read your letter. I understand your meaning. I want to say to you, very plainly, what I have not until now said in any of the letters between us, because the not saying has gone on long enough, and your letter has made it possible to say it. I am not going to marry the draper. I am going to refuse him. I am going to refuse him because I do not love him. I am going to tell my father that I am going to refuse him, and my father will be angry, and my father will perhaps stop speaking to me for some weeks. And in the end, my father will accept it, because he has always, in the end, accepted what I have decided. I have been writing to you for 3 years. I will write to you for 3 more. I will write to you for 30 more. I will write to you for the rest of my life, Thomas, regardless of who I marry or do not marry, and the only thing that has ever been at risk, in the question of my marrying or not marrying, is whether the letters from me will continue to come from a woman who can speak to you with the honesty I am speaking to you with now, and the answer is yes. They will. Whatever happens, they will. Please write back. Thomas wrote back. His letter, when it came, was very long and very careful and very gentle, and it did not directly mention what Isabel had written, except in one sentence at the end where he said, Asterisk, you are the most honest woman I have known. Whatever happens, please continue to be that. I will continue to be whatever it is I have been to you. Asterisk, the correspondence resumed in its old rhythm. Isabel told her father the following month that she would not marry the draper. Her father was angry. He was angry for almost 6 weeks. He stopped speaking to her at meals. He took his suppers in the small room behind the kitchen, alone with his ledger. Margaret came to talk to him. Margaret could not move him. Isabel waited. She continued to do the small daily work of running her father's household in the small careful way she had run it since she was 16. She did not press him. In the 7th week, on a cold evening in late January, her father came into the kitchen where she was kneading bread. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he sat down at the small kitchen table and watched her work. "I was wrong," he said after a while. "You were not wrong, father. He was a good match. He was a good match. I was wrong to push you toward him. You will forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive." "There is. You will forgive me anyway. Will you finish the bread and come and sit with me? I am old, Isabel. I have been alone in the small back room for 6 weeks, eating cold suppers, and I am sorry for it. Come and sit." She finished the bread. She came and sat with him. A second offer of marriage came 2 years later from a younger man in the town, a cloth merchant named Henry, 28 years old, also a widower, also with children, but a man Isabel had known her whole life and had liked since she was a girl. Henry was tall and quiet and steady, and he had loved his first wife very much, and his first wife had died of a fever in the 2nd year of their marriage, and had left him with 2 small children, a boy of 3 and a girl of 1. And Henry had been a widower for 2 years, and had not been intending to remarry until he had, on a particular afternoon in the late autumn of Isabel's 24th year, met her in the cathedral square and walked her home and asked, the following week, whether he might call on her. Isabel had liked Henry. She had liked him for a long time. He was not Thomas. She knew that, sitting in the small parlor with him on the Sunday afternoon he had come to call. He knew it too. He told her so, in the careful, steady way he told her most things on the 3rd visit. "I know there is someone you write to," Henry said. "Margaret has told me. She told me before I came to call the first time, because she wanted me to know what I was asking for. I want to ask anyway, Isabel. I have known you a long time. I think you would be a good wife. I think my children would love you. I think we would have a good life. I am not asking you to give up the letters. I am asking you to consider whether you could have me as a husband and the letters as letters, both, and make a life that contained both. You would have to tell me, of course, that I was the husband. The letters would have to be letters and nothing more. But I'm not asking you to choose between us. I am asking whether the bargain is one you can make." Isabel looked at Henry across the small parlor. She thought about him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the 7 years of letters. She thought about what kind of life would lie ahead of her if she did not marry, her father aging, the household eventually passing to Margaret's children, Isabel herself becoming, in the slow, careful way unmarried women in small towns sometimes became, the aunt who lived in a small room at the back of someone else's house. "I will need to write to him," she said. "Yes. I will need to tell him before I tell you yes or no. Yes. You will not be jealous of the letters. I will not. I have been a husband before, Isabel. I know what jealousy is. The letters are not what jealousy is for. The letters are what they are, and I do not need to be inside them. I need only to be the husband." She wrote to Thomas that evening. She told him about Henry. She told him she liked Henry, and that she thought she would marry him, and that the marriage would not change the letters. She told him she had been a long time considering whether to write to him about it, because the writing about it was a kind of asking permission, and she did not want to ask his permission for a thing that was hers to decide. She told him she was telling him anyway, because 7 years of letters had earned that. Thomas's reply, when it came 3 weeks later, was 4 words long. Asterisk, marry him, be happy. Asterisk, then a longer letter the following week, about his bay mare and a book he had been reading. The correspondence resumed in its old rhythm. Isabel married Henry in the spring of her 25th year, in the small chapel of the town's cathedral, on a clear, bright morning in early May. Her father walked her down the aisle. He had wept the night before. He had said, very quietly, sitting in the kitchen with her after supper, that he had been wrong about the draper 4 years ago, and was not wrong about Henry, and that he was very glad. Isabel had held his hand. She had wept too. The wedding day was a small, careful day. The chapel was full of the people Isabel had known her whole life. Henry's two children, the boy now 7 and the girl now 5, stood at the front of the chapel beside their father and watched Isabel come down the aisle, and the boy waved at her in the small, earnest way of 7-year-old boys who have been told to be on their best behavior. Isabel waved back. Henry's small, careful smile, when she reached him at the altar, was the smile of a man who had not, 3 years ago, expected to be standing at an altar a second time, and who was deeply, quietly grateful that he was. They had a small wedding feast in Isabel's father's house in the afternoon. Margaret and her husband came. Henry's brother came down from the city to the north. The cook had made the harvest cakes. The town's children came to the gate to see the bride. Isabel, in her dark blue gown that was not white because she did not wish to wear white at a second wedding to a man who had loved another woman first, stood with Henry in the garden in the late afternoon light, and Henry took her hand, and she felt a small steady warmth that was not the same warmth she would have felt for Thomas, but that was its own warmth, and she understood in that moment that she had made a good bargain. She wrote a letter to Thomas the following morning before she and Henry left for the city. She wrote, "I am married." The wedding was small. Henry's son waved at me from the altar. "I am going to the north today to begin my life there. I will write to you next month from my new house." She wrote next month, as she had said. The marriage was a happy one. Henry was a good husband. He was steady and kind and patient, and he never, in any of the 13 years of their marriage, ever asked Isabel to choose between him and the letters. The letters from Thomas came every 2 weeks in their old rhythm. Henry knew, in the small, unremarkable way that husbands know what their wives are doing, when the letters had arrived. He did not ask about them. Sometimes, in the evenings, Isabel would tell him a small thing that had been in the letter, a story Thomas had told about his bay mare's foal, or a book he had been reading, and Henry would listen and ask a small, kind question, and the conversation would move on to other things. The letters were part of the household, in the way that a small, steady weather pattern is part of a household. They came. They were answered. They went out. Henry did not interfere. Isabel wrote them at her small writing desk in the front room of their house in the city, at any hour she chose, and Henry did not, in 13 years, ever read one. She had 3 children with Henry. The first was a daughter, born in the 2nd year of the marriage, whom they named Margaret after Isabel's older sister. The second was a son, born 2 years later, whom they named John after Isabel's father. The third was another daughter, born after a long gap in the 7th year of the marriage, whom they named Anne, simply because Isabel had always liked the name. Henry's 2 older children, the boy and the girl from his first marriage, grew up in the household and called Isabel mother, and she loved them as she loved her own. The household was busy. 5 children. A draper's business that, by the 5th year of the marriage, had begun to do well enough that Henry was thinking about a second shop. A house that needed running. A garden. A circle of friends in the city, other merchants' wives, Henry's brother and his wife, the family of the priest at the small church around the corner. Isabel had never in her life been busier or more rooted. She was, by every measure that the city could see, a woman who had made an excellent marriage and was making a happy life of it. She thought about Thomas perhaps once a fortnight when his letter arrived. She did not think about him otherwise. She had not the time. Children needed her. Henry needed her. The household needed her. The letters were the small steady thread that ran underneath the larger fabric of her life, and she did not, in any of the 13 years of her marriage, mistake the thread for the fabric. In the 2nd year of her marriage, Isabel planted a quince tree in the courtyard of Henry's house, in a corner where the south sun caught the wall and the soil was warm and dry. The tree took. It thrived. It began to fruit in its 4th year. The cook made a thick spiced preserve from the fruit every autumn, and the household ate it on bread on cold mornings throughout the winter. And Isabel, when she sat in the courtyard in the evenings of the warmer months and watched her children play around the small fountain, sometimes thought about the tree as her own small marker of the years of the marriage. A tree she had planted with her own hands in the 2nd year, that had grown, that had borne fruit, that had become, in the slow, steady way of trees, a part of the household she had built. She wrote to Thomas about the quince tree. She wrote to him about the children. She wrote to him about the small daily incidents of running a draper's household in a city in the north. She did not, in any of those letters, write to him about her happiness directly. She did not need to. Her happiness was the underwater tone of the letters in those years, the steady, warm note that ran beneath everything else she wrote. Thomas's letters, in those years, had their own steady, warm note. He had been given a small captaincy at his lord's manor in the 4th year of Isabel's marriage. He had a stipend that was modest but adequate. He had a small stone room in the upper part of the manor, with a window that looked out over a small river behind the manor walls, and a particular willow tree at the river bend, where he sat in the long summer evenings and read Isabel's letters. He had bought a cedar box for them in a market in the city to the north, the same city Isabel lived in, though by a coincidence he had not known about when he bought the box, and he kept her letters in it, in order of date, and he reread them in the long winters when the manor was quiet. He had a friend at the manor, a man named Owain, who was the master of horse, a steady, patient man of 45, who had been Thomas's companion since Thomas had first come to the manor at 20. Owain knew about the letters. Owain knew about Isabel. Owain had asked Thomas once in the 3rd year of Isabel's marriage whether Thomas had ever considered marrying himself. Thomas had thought about this for a long while. They had been sitting in the manor's small kitchen on a winter afternoon with cups of warm ale. "I have considered it," Thomas had said. "I have decided not to. Because of her. Because of her. And because I am not certain I would be a good husband to anyone else. I have spent 15 years writing letters to one woman. I am not certain I have it in me to begin a different correspondence with someone different. I am 35 years old. The shape of my life is set. It is a narrow shape, but it is mine, and I am, in the small careful way one can be, content within it. Are you, Thomas?" Thomas had looked at his friend across the small kitchen. "Most days," he had said. "Most days, yes. There are some that are harder. There are evenings when I sit at the willow and read her letters, and I am very aware of the river moving, and of the years moving, and of my body getting older, and on those evenings I am not as content as I usually am. But the next morning is usually all right, and the morning after that. I have learned, in 15 years of these letters, how to live in the rhythm of them, and the rhythm is kind." Owain had nodded slowly. "You know, Thomas," he had said, "if she ever comes to you, the household will not turn her away. I know. It will not. I have spoken to my lord. He knows about the letters. He has known for many years. He has said to me directly that if there ever comes a day when the woman in the letters comes to the manor will hold her. He thought you should know that. He has not told me himself. No. He thought it should come from me, not from him. He did not want you to feel the Lord's shadow on the matter. He wanted you to know in the way a friend tells a friend." Thomas had been very quiet for a long while. "Thank you, Owain," he had said. "I am very grateful." In the 17th year of the correspondence, when Isabel was 36 and Thomas was 40, Isabel's husband Henry took a fever in the late autumn. It was a small fever at first. Henry had come home from the shop in the late afternoon with a cough and a small flush in his cheeks. Isabel had put him to bed and had made a broth. By the next morning he was worse. By the 3rd day the fever was deep. The physician came. The physician came again. The fever went into Henry's chest and would not come out. On the 7th day, in the small hours of the night, Henry called Isabel to his bedside and asked her to send the children out of the room. She sent them out. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took his hand. "Isabel," he said. His voice was very thin. "Listen, I am listening. You will write to him. To Henry. To Thomas. After, you will write to him. You will tell him I have died. You will not please wait the conventional year. The conventional year is for women who want to be conventional. You are not conventional. You will write to him after a few months. You will tell him to come to you. I want you to do this for me. I do not want to die thinking you are going to be alone for the rest of your life out of respect for me. I do not want that respect. Do you hear me, Isabel?" "I hear you, Henry. Promise me." "I promise." "Good. Now bring the children in. I have a few things to say to them." He died that night with his children around him and Isabel holding his hand. He was 48 years old. He had been a good husband for 13 years. Isabel grieved him. She grieved him for the full year. She did not, despite his deathbed instruction, write to Thomas to come to her after a few months. She wore mourning. She kept the house. She managed the draper's business with the help of Henry's two senior journeymen, who were honest men and to whom she gave her full trust. She wrote to Thomas every 2 weeks in the old rhythm. The letters to Thomas in that year were quieter than they had been. They were the letters of a woman in mourning. He understood. His letters to her were also quieter. They did not, by unspoken agreement, refer to the question that lay underneath them. In the 18th year of the correspondence, in the late spring, when the year of mourning had passed, Isabel wrote a different kind of letter. She wrote it at a small writing desk in the front room of the house, on a clear morning in May. Her younger daughter Anne, who was now 8, was playing in the courtyard with the cook's daughter. The quince tree was in white bloom. Isabel wrote slowly. She wrote in a hand that was less steady than her usual hand. The letter said, in essence, that her year of full mourning had passed, that her household was in good order, that her elder children were nearly grown, that she was 37 years old, a widow of moderate means, that she would, if Thomas was willing, be glad to see him at her house at her invitation, on whatever date might suit him. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She sealed the letter. She gave it to the courier who came south from the city on the road to the manors of the eastern hills. She watched him ride out through the gate. She waited. Thomas read the letter at his small table by the willow tree at the river behind the manor. In the late afternoon of the day it reached him 3 weeks later. He read it 3 times. He set it down. He sat for a long while looking at the river. He should have ridden south at once. He afterwards regretted, in a way he could not bring himself to think about for very long, that he did not. The reason he did not was that there was a campaign that summer. The lord of the next valley to the east had gone east to support an ally in a small border dispute, and Thomas, as one of the lord's captains, had taken on the responsibility for 40 men under his command, and he could not, in honor, set aside that command in the middle of the campaigning season for a private matter, however dear. He wrote to Isabel a fortnight after her letter. He told her he would come to her in the autumn after the campaign. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had waited 18 years and could wait a few months more if she could. She wrote back, *I can wait. Come to me when you can. I am here. The campaign was a difficult one. The country it was fought in was hot in midsummer, with little water and uncertain provisioning. There was a great deal of marching. There were several small skirmishes that produced casualties out of all proportion to their importance. Thomas, who was 40 years old, was older than most of the men in the field, and he was a captain, and he led his 40 men in the way he had been taught, carefully, without unnecessary risk, from the front when the front was needed. His sergeant was a man named Mac, a hard, wiry veteran of 50 who had fought in 3 campaigns under Thomas's lord, and who had been, since Thomas had been given his captaincy, the man Thomas trusted most among his soldiers. Mac had a wife and 3 children in a village near the manor. He was a quiet, competent man who did not, by temperament, show the men he was afraid even when he was. He kept Thomas's 40 men together through July and August. In the first week of September, on a clear, cool morning at a small ford on a river that was no one's particular boundary, Thomas's men were ambushed by a small force of the enemy that had been concealed in a low grove of oak trees on the far side of the ford. Thomas was on horseback at the front of the column. The first volley of crossbow bolts came out of the oak grove without warning. 2 of his men went down at once. Thomas had been turning in his saddle to call to Mac when the second volley came. A bolt struck him in the upper thigh. He fell from his horse. What he afterwards remembered of the next minutes was Mac's face above him, very close, with a small line of blood across the sergeant's cheek where another bolt had grazed him. Mac was shouting at the men. Mac was dragging Thomas backwards out of the line of fire by the shoulders of his cuirass, with the boots of his men around them. Mac was saying, in a voice that Thomas had never heard the sergeant use before, "Stay with me, Captain. Stay with me, Thomas. Do not close your eyes." Thomas had not closed his eyes. He had stayed. Mac had got him out of the ford. The skirmish had broken when Thomas's men, seeing their captain down, had charged the oak grove with a fury Thomas afterwards heard described, and could not himself remember witnessing. The enemy force, which had been smaller than expected, had withdrawn. Thomas's men had taken the ford. They had pulled the bolt from Thomas's thigh in the field hospital that night. The bolt itself had not killed him. The infection had nearly killed him. The wound, in the heat of early September, had become infected within 4 days. The infection had gone deep into the leg. By the time the army returned to the manor in late September, Thomas had been riding in a litter for 12 days, with a fever that came and went, and the surgeon at the manor had told him on the morning of his return, very plainly, that the leg would have to come off above the knee if he was to live. Thomas had refused. He had refused for several reasons. The deepest of them, which he gave to no one, was that he did not wish Isabel, after 18 years of waiting, to come at last to a man who was less than the man she had imagined him to be. His lord had come to his bedside the next evening. The lord was an old man by then, almost 70, with white hair worn long over his shoulders and a careful, steady manner that had been the manner of every lord of the Eastern Valley for as long as Thomas had served him. He sat down in the chair beside Thomas's bed. He did not speak for a long while. Then he said, "Thomas, the surgeon has told me you will not let him take the leg." "My lord, you are afraid she will not, have you?" "My lord, I have known about the letters for many years, Thomas. I have known about her name for many years. I know she is a widow now. I know she has written to you. Owain has, with my permission, told me what he has told you. Hear me, son. Listen to an old man who has seen more weddings than you have. The woman who has written to one man for 18 years does not love a leg. She loves a man. She will have him back from this campaign with one leg, and she will have him gladly, and you will give her the chance to do so. You will not, out of vanity, throw away the only love you have had in your life, and her only chance to have hers. You will let the surgeon take the leg. That is not an order. It is the strongest piece of advice an old man has ever given a younger one. Do you hear me?" Thomas had heard him. He had let the surgeon take the leg the next morning. He had not died. He had come near to it in the second week, when the fever had returned worse than before, but he had not died. By the end of October, he had been sitting up. By the end of November, he had been moving about his small stone room with the help of a wooden crutch his lord had ordered made for him. He had not, in those weeks, been able to bring himself to write to Isabel. He had not known what to write. He had thought, many times in the long, fevered nights, about writing to her to release her from any expectation that he would now come to her. He had not, in the end, written that letter. He had been too tired. He had been too weak. He had been also too in love with her. Isabel, in the city to the north, had begun to wonder. She had not, at first, allowed herself to think the worst. She had told herself the campaign had run long. By the third week of October, when no rider had come south with a letter from him, she had begun to feel a small, cold thing turning over in her stomach. By the second week of November, she had stopped sleeping properly. By the end of November, she had begun, in the small hours, to imagine the worst things she could imagine. In the first week of December, a rider came at last. He was not a courier. He was a young man of perhaps 20, in the colours of Thomas's lord, with the careful, patient manner of a man who had been chosen for his task because he could be trusted with it. His name was Cadog. He had ridden from the manor in 3 days. His horse was tired, and his cloak was wet from the road, and he stood in the courtyard of Isabel's house with his cap in his hands. Isabel met him in the courtyard. She put her hand on the bridle of his horse to steady herself. "My captain sent me to tell you in person what he could not bring himself to tell you in writing," Cadog said. He told her. He told her about the campaign, and the ford, and the bolt, and the infection, and the leg that had been taken in the second week of October. He told her that Thomas was alive. He told her that Thomas had been afraid to write to her. He told her that he, Cadog, had been sent because Owain, the master of horse, had argued in the Lord's Hall that someone needed to be sent before Thomas wrote himself out of the only happiness Owain had ever seen him close to. Isabel listened in the courtyard with her hand on the bridle of the horse. When Cadog had finished, she stood for a long moment in silence. Then she said, "Wait here. I will write a letter. You will take it to him." She went into the house. She wrote the letter standing at her writing desk because she did not trust her legs to hold her if she sat down. She wrote in 3 short sentences. She sealed it. She came back to the courtyard. She gave the letter to Cadog. Cadog nodded. He mounted his horse. He rode out of the courtyard. The letter said, "I am coming to you. I will be at your door in 9 days. You are still the man I love. Please be at the door." Thomas read the letter 3 days later, on the afternoon of the 8th of December, sitting at his small table by the window of his stone room. He read it 3 times. He folded it. He put it in the cedar barks with the others. He sat for a long while looking out at the river behind the manor. He understood at last that he had been wrong, that what she wanted was not the man he had imagined he had to be, that she was coming to him, and that he had only to be at the door. She came on the 9th day. It had snowed in the highlands. The road up from the city was hard. Her small party herself, her younger daughter Anne, who was now 8, and 2 servants, had been delayed half a day by a fallen tree. They came up the long lane to the manor in the late afternoon, in the cold blue dusk, with the lanterns of the manor already lit at the gatehouse. Thomas was at the door. He was on his crutch. He had washed and combed his hair. He had put on his best coat hardy, which was 18 years old, and had been mended many times. He had stood at the door for 2 hours, because he had not trusted himself to know exactly when she would come, and he had wanted to be there when she did. She got down from her horse in the courtyard. She did not cross the courtyard slowly. She walked. Then she ran the last few paces in her travelling cloak, and Thomas, on his crutch, did not quite manage to step down from the threshold to meet her, and she came up to him at the door and stopped, very close, and put up both of her hands and laid them on either side of his face, and said very quietly, "Thomas." He said, "Isabel." They were married 3 weeks later, on a cold, bright morning in early January, in the small chapel of the manor. Owain stood as Thomas's man. Anne stood with her mother. Thomas's lord came to the wedding feast in the manor's hall in the afternoon, and gave a small speech in honour of his captain, and gave Isabel a small silver cup with the household's falcon device on it, which she kept at her writing desk for the rest of her life. They had 11 years together. The 11 years are the part of this story that is easiest to summarize and hardest to do justice to. They lived in a small stone farmhouse in the hill country between the manor and the city, a property Isabel had inherited from an aunt that had a south-facing courtyard with a low stone wall and a small orchard, and a view across the rolling country toward the eastern hills. Thomas took up the running of the property. He had a wooden leg now, made for him by a craftsman in the next valley, and he had learned to walk with it, and to ride a horse with a special saddle, and although he could no longer take a long walk, he could do most of what the property required of him. He took up beekeeping. He kept 4 hives at the bottom of the orchard. He read aloud to Isabel in the evenings. Anne, who had come north with her mother on the snowy December road, grew up in that house. She was 8 when they married. She was 19 when she was married herself, in the small chapel of the manor, to a young man named Owain, not the master of horse Owain, who had been Thomas's friend for many years, and who had died in the 8th year of Thomas and Isabel's marriage of an old soldier's chest illness, but the master of horse's son, who had been 3 years old when Thomas had become Anne's stepfather, and who had grown up running between the manor and the stone farmhouse, and who had loved Anne since he was 7 and Anne had been 10, and had thrown a small wooden ball at his head in the manor courtyard. He had thrown it back. They had been friends ever since. They were married in the spring of Anne's 19th year, on a clear morning in late April, and Thomas walked Anne down the aisle in his careful, slow way on his wooden leg, and Isabel watched from the front pew with her hand on her own mother's small grey psalter, in which the small pale blue river flower from 40 years ago was still pressed. The wedding was a small careful day. The cathedral of the manor was full of the people Anne had known her whole life. Thomas's lord, now very old, came and gave the bride away with Thomas. Owain the younger, in his best coat hardy, stood at the altar with the small careful smile of a man who had loved one woman his whole life and had been given her at last. Anne, in a pale grey gown that had been her mother's, walked down the aisle with the patience of a young woman who had been waiting for this morning since she had been 10 years old. The wedding feast was held in the courtyard of the stone farmhouse on a warm afternoon, under the white blossom of the quince tree that Thomas had planted for Isabel in the 2nd year of their marriage, in the corner where the south sun caught the wall, the same kind of tree, in the same kind of corner, as the one Isabel had planted in Henry's house in the city 20-odd years before. The new tree had borne its first fruit the previous autumn. Anne and Owain the younger ate the spiced quince preserve on bread on the morning of the wedding. The cook had made it from the previous year's fruit. There is one afternoon, in the 11 years, that Thomas wrote down later in a long letter to no one, that I want to tell you about, because of all the small careful afternoons of those years, it is the one he most wanted to remember. It was the 7th year of their marriage. It was a Tuesday. It was the first really warm afternoon of late spring. Isabel was 44 years old. Thomas was 47. They had been sitting on the small, low stone bench under the quince tree in the courtyard for perhaps an hour. Thomas had been reading aloud to Isabel from an old book of pilgrim tales they had both loved as children, a book they had written about in their first year of letters, when they had still been getting to know each other. The tale he had been reading was the tale of a young pilgrim who had set out for a holy place in the south, who had been waylaid by a series of small misfortunes, who had arrived at the holy place very late, 20 years after he had set out, an old man, only to find that the holy place was no longer there. It had been pulled down in a war that had passed through that country, and the old pilgrim had stood in the empty square where the holy place had once been, and had laid down his pilgrim's staff, and had wept, and had decided that the journey itself had perhaps been the holy thing, and that the place had only ever been an excuse. Thomas had finished the tale. He had closed the book. He had sat for a moment in silence. Then he had said, without looking at Isabel, "I have come to think that we are like that pilgrim. The place we set out for is gone, but we have arrived anyway, and the journey, I find, has been the thing." Isabel had set down her embroidery. She had reached over and taken his hand. She had not said anything for a long while. Then she had said, very quietly, "Yes." That was the whole of the conversation. Thomas wrote it down 13 years later. He had not forgotten any of it. He had remembered, in the writing, the exact angle of the sun through the quince leaves on Isabel's face, and the exact pressure of her hand on his, and a small honeybee that had passed between them as she spoke. Isabel died in the spring of the 11th year of their marriage, of a fever that came on suddenly and that the local physician could not name. She was 48 years old. She died in the bed in the south room of the stone farmhouse, with Thomas beside her, holding her hand. Anne had come from the manor that morning, with Owain the younger and their 3 small children, and had sat with her mother through the afternoon. Thomas's friend, a younger man who had been the master of horse since old Owain's death, had ridden over from the manor in the late evening and had kept Thomas company through the night. Isabel's last words, which Thomas was to remember every day for the next 19 years, were, "I am glad, Thomas, I am glad we had this." Thomas was 51. He stayed in the farmhouse. He did not remarry. He kept the bees and the quince tree and the cedar barks of her letters. Anne and her family came to visit every fortnight. The manor sent a man down once a week with the household's news. Thomas read her letters, in the long evenings of the years after, in order from the first to the last. He read them slowly. The first time he took 6 months. He had not wanted to come to the end. When he came to the end, in the late autumn of the year, with the last letter, the one she had written him from her own deathbed 3 days before she died, in a hand that was almost too weak to hold the pen, he sat for a long while at his small table and did not move. The next morning he started the letters again from the first. He read them through a second time, more slowly. He had begun to forget small things, and the second reading reminded him. He read them through 7 times in the next 19 years. The 7th reading he began on his 69th birthday. He read slowly. He had become old. His hands were not steady. He had begun, in the way of old men, to read aloud to himself in the evenings. He read her letters aloud in the small front room of the stone farmhouse in the warm candlelight. Anne came to visit him in the 7th year of his solitude and found him reading aloud one evening, and she had sat with him in the doorway for a long while, listening, and she had not interrupted him, and at the end of the chapter, for that is how Thomas had come by then to think of the letters, as the chapters of a single long book that Isabel had written to him over 41 years. He had set the letter down and looked up and seen Anne in the doorway and smiled at her in the careful, slow way of an old man and said, "Come in, daughter, come and listen with me." Anne had come in. She had sat with him by the fire. She had listened to him read the next letter. She had not, she would say later to her own daughter, ever loved her stepfather more than in that hour. Thomas died in the winter of his 70th year, in his sleep, in the same bed in the same south room of the stone farmhouse. The cedar box was on the small table beside the bed. He had been reading the 11th letter of the 7th rereading the night before. The letter was open on top of the box. On a separate piece of paper in his own hand, dated the 4th of December that very year, he had written, "Asterisk, I have had her letters, in the end, longer than I had her. I have read them, in the end, more times than she ever wrote them. I do not know if this counts as the longer love or the shorter one. I do not know if it matters." Asterisk, he had signed it, in his careful old man's hand. Asterisk, Thomas. Asterisk, the 2 cedar boxes, his, with her letters, and hers, with his, were inherited by Anne. She kept them all her life. She passed them on to her own daughter at her death. The boxes came down through the family for 4 more generations, and were lost at last in a fire in a country house in the north of the same kingdom, in the autumn of a year that no one in this story would have lived to see. The letters did not survive, but the quince tree in the south-facing courtyard of the stone farmhouse lived for 120 years. It fruited every autumn. The people who lived in the farmhouse after Anne sold it, and the people who lived in it after them, did not always know whose tree it had been, or why it had been planted. They sat under it in the long, quiet southern afternoons of summer. They ate its fruit in the autumns. The tree kept, in the small, slow way that trees keep such things, the memory of 2 people who had loved each other for 41 years, mostly in letters, and for the last 11 of those years, in a stone farmhouse on a rise. The small, pale blue river flower from the cathedral close in the south, pressed in Isabel's psalter on the evening she had met Thomas, was given by Thomas to Anne on the morning of Anne's wedding to the master of horses' son. Anne kept it in her own psalter all her life. It was lost, eventually, in the same fire that took the cedar boxes. The story is ended. Sleep well.